pleasure that we're back in session, back in business with the Washington History Seminar, and it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon, who is Willard Sunderland, who teaches history at the University of Cincinnati. Over the years, he has lived and traveled extensively in Russia and other states of the former USSR, and he has published widely on Russia's imperial history. He currently serves as editor of the journal Critica, Explorations in Russian and Eurasian History. His first book was Taming the Wild Field, Colonization on the Russian Steppe. The book we're talking about today is The Baron's Cloak, A History of the Russian Empire in War and Revolution, which is available for purchase afterwards right outside of this room. I finished reading this last night, and I can tell you it's one of those rare academic books that I think is engaging on its own scholarly level, but is absolutely accessible to broader, wider audiences, something that I think we should certainly encourage from those of us in the academic business. It's a great read, a terrific story, and a great read. And today he will be speaking on Journeys with Baron Ungern, Empire.
Quote that I think I heard long ago by, or attributed to the American writer John Gardner, was that there are only two plots in all of world literature. A man leaves on a journey, and a stranger comes to town. I was thinking about it. I hope I misremembered the quote, because there must be more plots than that in world literature, and surely women take journeys too. But I do like the idea that you could get something going with a storyline like a stranger comes to town. So I wanted to start my remarks today by delving right into one moment that precisely deals with this particular plot. The town is this place, which I'm worried you can't see so well. It's a town known to the Europeans as Ungern. Now the world knows it as Ulaanbaatar, capital of Mongolia. The stranger, whom I'm worried you also can't see so well, I'm afraid, is... Can we dim the lights a little bit?
The problem is the cameras won't be able to capture. If you stand up, you're welcome to stand up, but then you need to grab the mic so that...
oh, I see. Should I stay in the camera here? I apologize.
Well, you can stand up, but you need to...
Right. Okay, so we'll do things at once might be hard. The stranger who comes to town is on your screen here. It's Nikolai Roman Max von Ungern. The town, Ungern, in the moment that I want to talk about, February 1921, was a town in kind of existential limbo. The Qing Empire, the Qing dynasty, had ruled Mongolian lands for some 200 years. But in the course of a series of rippling revolts in 1911 into 1912, the Qing Empire fell, overturned to lead way to a new Chinese republic. And the Mongols took advantage of this stewing to declare their own independence. The new Chinese rulers, even though they were very anti-Qing, were not at all happy at losing any of their territory. So they objected to Mongolian independence. The Mongols did what they had grown accustomed to in the preceding decades, which is take advantage of a kind of wrestling match under the blanket between the Russian and the Chinese Empire over these borderland territories. And they sought the support of the Russian side. The Tsarist government had its own concerns about Mongolian independence, and consequently took a pretty gingerly view, and ultimately encouraged the Mongols to seek autonomy within a new China. When the Great War started, on the European side of the Russian Empire, the Russians were even more interested in making sure that they didn't have any trouble on the Mongolian frontier, and so they quickly worked with their Mongolian partners and the Chinese to secure a treaty that guaranteed Mongolian autonomy within a new China. But then things got much worse for the Russian Empire because the Great War went on much longer than anyone expected, and it turned into a terrible revolution, which further weakened Russia's influence on this side of things. And the Chinese, who were never happy with the autonomous arrangement to begin with, took full advantage of the fact that the patron that was securing autonomy for the Mongols had left the stage, and they moved back in. So in 1921, even though this city would in time become the capital of independent Mongolia, a Chinese garrison had returned to Ungern, and the city was ruled by, in effect, a Chinese general, local warlord. It was also a site of the massing of refugees spilling out of the territories of the Russian Empire that had been churned up by revolution and civil war. It was a place of intrigue as the different camps on the Russian side sought to exploit this base beyond Russia's border. And of course, it was a site of tremendous resentment of local Mongols against Chinese traders and against the Chinese garrison, which seemed to take advantage of the local economy. So it was a city with a questionable position. It was also very cold, very poor, and for many people, a pretty miserable place to be in February 1921. 60,000 people perhaps, maybe 6, 8, 9,000 Chinese soldiers. Ungern Sternberg, the stranger, by this time I think we could describe him in a few simple terms. He was a Baltic German aristocrat, a Tsarist military officer of the Cossack regiments. He was a Lutheran, but he had clearly expressed leanings towards mystical forms of Christianity, including Russian Orthodoxy and Buddhism. He was an anti-Semite. He was a friend and right-hand man to the de facto ruler of the Russian Transbaikal region just over the Mongolian border, so-called Ataman Semyonov. And in this particular moment, February 1921, he was a refugee because he too had been flushed out of the Russian Empire by the turning tides of the Russian Civil War. As a white military commander, he helped Ataman Semyonov in the Transbaikal region for the better part of the preceding 3 years in an on and off again guerrilla war of checks and beatings and interrogations. But the front against the Reds had started crumbling as Red forces advanced across Siberia. Most whites on Ungern's side left for points further east. They left for Russian settlements in the area of Russian-controlled Manchuria, or they went still farther, all the way to the Pacific, to places like Vladivostok. But Ungern was a military commander, and he had some 1,000 or 1,200 men at his disposal, mostly cavalry. They were organized in a special fighting force called the Asiatic Division. They were made up of peoples of all sorts from around the Russian Empire and beyond. Buryats, Tatars, Bashkirs, Russians, of course, many of them men who fought in the Cossack regiments under the Tsars. The odd German, like Ungern, and even other sorts of foreigners, Turkish and Austrian prisoners of war. In time, they would also garner to their side Japanese fighters, Tibetans, and still more different types. Ungern decided that in the moment that presented itself to him, rather than go farther east like everybody else, he might as well use the forces at his disposal to go south. And so he crossed the border. He moved into Mongolia in late 1920. And by February 1921, after a couple repulsed attacks on the head town of Ungern, he made a final serious push, this time with even more men at his disposal because he'd worked over the preceding months to draw in still more fighters who'd come over from the Russian side and to play favors as much as he could with supporters from along the Mongols. So with about 5,000 men on the first day of February 1921, he attacked the city. This map is a modern cartographer's drawing of a map that I found in the archives of the Hoover Institution in Stanford. It was composed by hand on the back of a fairly humble piece of paper by one of the officers who had served in Ungern's forces. And it shows the lay of the attack as Ungern's division, aided by Mongol allies, descended upon the city. They came in so quickly, according to the reports that reached the Red Side, who wrote these things down in their intelligence files, that the Chinese garrison didn't have time to pull on their underwear. That was one of the more colorful notes that I found in archives in Siberia. The attack was indeed a remarkable military operation, but it was also a very obvious political event. It was about, right from the start, getting some messages across and building new communities. So as the forces under Ungern's command and those of its Mongol allies took the town, flushing out the Chinese who fled north towards the Russian border on the capital road, two pogroms unfolded at the same time. Ungern, a fierce anti-Semite and an absolutely committed hater of the Bolsheviks, ordered his men, some of whom seem to have been rather willing, to seek down and kill all Jews and socialist sympathizers. At the very same time, the Mongols, caught up in their anti-Chinese rage, plundered Chinese stock shops and murdered Chinese traders. It was a really fantastic, brief, dramatic orgy of violence. But when this particular horror subsided, Ungern then did two very important things. First of all, he restored the Mongolian ruler, the Volga, the theocratic leader of the would-be Mongolian state, who had been imprisoned by the Chinese when the Chinese garrison returned to town. That was a very important act because Ungern needed the fundamental legitimacy provided by the Mongolian ruler to allow him to be the de facto military power in town. But then he did something truly curious. I mean, certainly not what most of us would have expected. He committed himself to an extensive diplomatic campaign to create a widespread coalition that would bring together Mongols, Tibetans, Manchus, Chinese, and Russians, joined together to right the most terrible historical wrong of his time, which was the undoing of the great empires of the Qing and the Romanovs. In a tent, Mongol tent that was set up as his command post, he had a small team of translators and at least one typewriter, and we now have Russian copies of letters that he presumably dictated and were then translated into Manchu, Mongol, Chinese. And they describe his vision of the need to set the world right. The world works best when it's run by emperors. When the great Khans sat in Beijing, there was order in the world. The Mongols knew their place, the Mongols were supported. There's great misery in Russia, there's destruction in Europe, all because of the pestilence of socialism and the undoing of empire. These letters went out. We actually don't know much about how they were received because very few letters came back. And we also know that Ungern, as a military man, and a military man of a particular sort, was starting to get restless. Urga wasn't just miserable in the wintertime, it was also a vulnerable place. So even without these plans having gone very far, by the early spring, Ungern began making preparations for a decisive move. In fact, the kind of move that would prove he was serious about his empire restorationist plans. He gathered his men for a new assault on Russia, an attack on Red Siberia that ultimately reveals that Ungern knew very little about exactly what was going on the other side of the Russian border, and didn't fully appreciate that the Red Army by this time had become a remarkably effective military force. But with some, all told, perhaps 3,000 men at his disposal across all of Mongolia, across the grand swath of the Mongolian-Russian frontier, he mounted an attack on Red Siberia. He left Volga flying this banner, this standard. It spoke plainly of who he was going for. On the other side of this banner is the sketched face, recognizable from Russian icons, of Jesus, and the inscription, Znamya Bog, which means God is with us. And on this side is the year of the glorious campaign, 1921, and the monogram of the future Emperor Michael II, Nicholas II's younger brother, to whom Nicholas abdicated in the fiery uncertainty of the February Revolution, and who at the time was either, depending on your view, too much of a coward or far too smart to take the throne. But as far as Ungern is concerned, Michael represented the legitimate path of monarchy in Russia, and for the country to be righted, the rightful Tsar had to return to the throne. Ungern apparently didn't know, there's no evidence that he actually knew that by this time, not only was Nicholas and his family dead, but Michael had been murdered as well. At any rate, this campaign, which was surely doomed from the start, went wrong fairly quickly. Ungern was defeated on the border, and then scraped his way to survive for another couple months on the steppe, waging a kind of guerrilla war on Russian and then back in Mongolian territory. But ultimately, things got away from him. Some of the abuses of his rule, plus the desperation of the campaign, began to take their toll. There was a mutiny among his officers. They sprung on Ungern, and ultimately, through a complicated twisting and turning of events, Ungern himself ends up captured and delivered to the Red Army. This is in northern Mongolia in late summer 1921. Within a month, he finds himself about 1,000 miles further west in one of the great railway towns of western Siberia, a town then known as Novomykolaisk, now it's Novosibirsk, hauled up in front of one of the earliest show trial courts of the Soviet era. He was found guilty of crimes against the Soviet government, mass atrocities, visions of building a great new state in Central Eurasia, and of collaborating with the Japanese. He actually agreed with all the charges except the last one. As he surely knew right from the start, he was shot within just a couple hours of the end of the trial. So how do we get here? How do we get to this particular moment with a Russianized Baltic German baron, known for his sadism and anti-Semitism, leading a multi-ethnic force composed of a whole range of peoples of the old Russian Empire, committed to killing Jews in Mongolia where there aren't many Jews to begin with, and planning the restoration of empires with just a few thousand men, all of which seems just patently impossible. Well, the answer that most historians have provided is that we have to look somewhere between psychology and location to explain this story. I don't know if you can make out this. Psychology, well, no rational man would do this. So Ungern is surely mad. He's the mad Baron of Mongolia. Also the bloody Baron of Mongolia because of his commitment to various kinds of violence. He's also doing wild things in a wild place. I mean, Mongolia has served a lot of useful purposes from people who are from Mongolia for many, many years. One of them is as the ultimate cipher, the ultimate useful vacuum for describing just about anything that you want to be opposite from yourself. Mongolia is the edge of the world. Mongolia is the center of barbarism. Mongolia is the ultimate location of savagery. Mongolia is primitiveness plus. So if we see this kind of outsized craziness and wildness, well, it surely fits. We are in a wild place. These book covers suggest that that's the story. We can really judge a book by the cover. And unfortunately, we were almost going to judge my book by this cover. I don't know if you can make this up.
Could I just for this moment do this, because I want you to experience the horror that I had to ripple through me one evening when I got an email late at night from my publisher saying, Willard, we have the perfect cover for you. Madman Ungern, set against the backdrop of wild Mongolia, which looks something like the surface of the moon, or maybe the Great Plains in a very bad thunderstorm, with these wild, bugged-out eyes, a colorized photograph. There's no colorized photograph of Ungern. All of this is doctored up and ready to sell just like those other books.
You should turn it on.
Yes, I'm sorry, I should turn it back on.
Just a second, please. We'll take a photo. Just a second.
You'll take it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah? So I had to let out the author's painful, anguished cry by email. But haven't you read my book? Because my book is actually arguing the exact opposite. That is to say, rather than seeking to explain this curious moment that could be turned into a story about a deranged man in a wild place, as I found out more about the story and combined it with the things that I have been building to know as I studied the Russian Empire over many decades, what I saw in the story was a story of Ungern's imperial home and his particular imperial moment, this moment of, in effect, imperial unraveling, of the undoing of empire, and the desperation that resulted from that, and that ultimately had a profound effect on this man and on the events around him. And what really crystallized this for me, the symbol that seemed to speak to this for me, was the cloak. And thankfully I did prevail on my publisher. And they took the crazy bug-eyed, blue-eyed Ungern off the cover and just gave me the cloak, which is good. There was a hint of mystery here. I don't know if you can make it out. It's here, I can pass it. But certainly much closer to what I was hoping for from a book cover with this particular book inside. The deal, what is this? You can see it. You can go and find it at the Museum of the Armed Forces in Moscow. In fact, I've visited the museum several times. I've yet to actually see it on display, but I know it's been up on display periodically. The first time I visited and had a chance to see the cloak was actually hanging in the wardrobe of the chief curator of the material objects collection. And she said, hold on a second, do you mean this? And she pulled it right out. I then had this fantastic opportunity to really pour all over the cloak. It's made of silk. It's orangey gold, color reserved for nobles. It's marked with these colorful roundels, which I'm afraid you... May we turn... Would you diminish the lights just for a second so that you can see better? You see these colorful roundels of the geometric shapes? All of which also speak to a level of refinement for this particular deal. The cut of this cloak, which Russians would probably call a kaftan. I'm using the word deal, that's the Mongolian term for this dress. This particular deal is cut in the manner of the Khalkha nobles, which are the principal, the largest Mongol group of the region that the Chinese historically call Outer Mongolia. All of this fits. Ungern's a man of station. If he was going to be wearing Mongolian dress, surely he would wear a fine Mongolian deal like this. He was working with the Khalkha. Surely he was interested in persuading them that he knew their needs, that he related to their world. But this is a hybrid uniform, because in addition to the Mongolian features, which are obvious, Ungern has also outfitted his deal with the epaulets reminiscent of European armies. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. With epaulets reminiscent of European armies, marked with an old button of the Tsarist army. The monogram AS in Cyrillic, which stands for Ataman Semyonov, Ungern's putative commander at this point, and then 2 stars indicating his rank as a lieutenant general. He wore the deal along with Mongolian boots, cheeky, but just to make sure everybody knew where he was coming from, on his chest, as you can see from this other picture, he wore the Medal of the St. George's Cross, which is the highest order of decoration awarded for valor by the Tsarist army that Ungern had earned during his 3 years of fighting the Great War. And he wore a Tsarist issue officer's cap. Okay. So Ungern came to town dressed in multiple worlds, and himself representing the hybridity of his empire. Sorry. The deal was a hybrid form, but so was Ungern. Baltic German aristocrat, ultimately schooled in Russian military academies, a professing Lutheran, drawn to Buddhism, a European cosmopolitan, also conversant in Chinese history, devotee of empires, any empire, the Russian Empire and the Qing. So he might be indeed mad. I've never found full documentation of his madness. It strikes me as a question we can't really answer. We certainly can begin to explore him as an imperial product. And we can try to make sense of the events of his time through the lens of empire that he offers us. What I want to do in the remaining time I have is give you a picture of the biggest themes that emerge from my book in taking this approach to Ungern's life and Ungern's world. Really, my book is about the power and the enduring legacy of empire. And it's apropos today. There's a certain imperial nostalgia at work in Russian popular culture, in some of the public statements of Russian leaders. There's a very eager readiness to see imperialism in Russian actions from our side. All of this, though, is the sort of surface agitation. It's just the waves on the top. The really interesting thing that's still going on in Russia, and that we should appreciate, and that's so alive in the period that I study in my book, is the very complicated legacy of empire as a social form. Empire as a complicated interweaving of peoples and spaces that produces all kinds of social positions and cultural expressions that ultimately do take human form. I mean, they end up defining people. All kinds of people could be produced by empire. Ungern is just one example of one potential road. But he's a reminder of what a biographical approach to the problem of empire can do. It can open up a perspective on how empire becomes meaningful, how imperial relationships and understanding of imperial spaces becomes meaningful and actually sets paths for the way people work in the world. And I do think that this is something we should be paying attention to as we think about Russia today. If we look beyond the headlines and some of the easy prejudices on both the Russian and Western side, we can find something deeper, more complicated going on that we should really think about. And it does then make Ungern's story relevant. Really, in his life, I think we see the constant tension of unity and diversity playing itself out in a remarkable period. Ungern was born in 1886. He was shot in 1921. So he wasn't around for long, but he happened to coincide with an incredibly dramatic period in world history and certainly in the history of the Russian state. In just these 35 some years, really a little bit more than what we commonly refer to as a generation, the Tsarist world passed from a place of remarkable dynamism and promise, along with an awful lot of problems, but nonetheless remarkable dynamism and promise, into oblivion. And it clearly unmoored a whole range of people, including Ungern. To make sense of this period through the prism of empire, if we consider the tension between living together and living apart that was always a part of the way the empire worked, we can start to understand how empire mattered in Ungern's life and how it ultimately dictated his fate. So let me just take you on a brief tour of his life, knowing that I have maybe 15 or 20 minutes to go, right? That's about right. And then I'd be very happy to take your questions. Ungern was an incredibly mobile person. In fact, his whole life is one of movement and crossings between empires, between imperial regions within the Russian Empire, across undetermined frontiers. He was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire to a mother who was German, and a father who was Baltic German. He grew up in rural Estland, what is now Estonia, not too far from the capital city of what used to be called Reval, that is now Tallinn. He was schooled initially in a Russian gymnasium in Tallinn, and then moved to military academies in St. Petersburg. He was a terrible student. He didn't last long in his first academy. Restless, he jumped ship, literally, and got on the train, signed up for the Russo-Japanese War. He spent the better part of a year in the Russian army, though he did not see any fighting by the time he arrived in Manchuria. The war was done. But he came back from there having been turned around, at least enough to get back into school, a different military academy, and to start doing well, which for him meant earning C's. And he made it through. He was commissioned as a young officer in 1908, and then he stepped into a career as a Tsar's junior officer, serving in the Cossack regiments in the Russian Eastern Siberia and ultimately in the Far East. After a stint out there, as the rumblings of war beginning in Europe, he signs on for the fight and ends up spending the better part of 3 years fighting on all the Russian fronts of World War I, from eastern Prussia on the edge of the Baltic to northern Persia on the edges of Tabriz. When the February Revolution does away with the Tsar and all the mayhem of Russia's instability begins to grip, he finds his way back to eastern Siberia to take up the fight against the revolutionaries. And it's there that he creates his base, serving his friend, his regimental buddy, Georgy Semyonov, and for the better part of 3 years, effectively runs the border, the Russo-Chinese border near Mongolia for Semyonov. And from there, of course, begins his Mongolian campaign. So he reminds us, first and foremost, of the remarkable fluidity and mobility of his times. We'll talk about that. He also reminds us of imperial people like him who had imperial habits. The fact is, despite our casual use of terms, such that everybody in Russia is a Russian, Soviets are Russians, the Russians are Soviets, beneath these terms is a landscape of incredible diversity. According to the Russian census of 1897, there are some 130 million people in the Russian Empire, 110 different nationalities speaking 55 major languages. And within this incredible diversity of people, there is all kinds of blending, mixing, and local, in fact, regional imperial cultures. There are all kinds of people in between. Tsar Nicholas II spoke English and French easily as well as he spoke Russian, and his mother was Danish. His wife was German, although her mother was English. The court was incredibly cosmopolitan. But so too were the enemies of the court. Lenin was at least part Kalmuk. Stalin was Georgian. Felix Dzerzhinsky, the first leader of the first version of what would become the Soviet political police, was a Russianized Pole. Trotsky, the commander and genius behind the creation of the Red Army, was a Russianized Jew. The most wealthy man in all of the Russian Empire, and the man who had the greatest role to play in the murder of Grigory Rasputin, was a man named Prince Felix Yusupov. His ancestor was a Tatar prince, whose lands were conquered by the Russians in the course of the conquest of Kazan in the 16th century. Rasputin himself was a peasant from Siberia, but he lived very near to centers of Russian conquest, the Siberian towns of Tюмень and Tobolsk, which became really vectors for the spreading of Christianity in Siberia, and they represent really the anchors of Russian empire building in Asia. Everywhere you look in the Tsarist Russia, you find the complexities of diversity, and all these imperial people lived with imperial habits. Certainly, Russian cosmopolitans enjoyed shashlik from the Caucasus, dancing Polish dances, singing gypsy songs. There was a Central Asian mosque in St. Petersburg. There was a Moorish synagogue in Arvin. This place was a remarkable, dazzling laboratory, as one of the great historians of the period described it, of the world's cultures. The Baltic Germans were a special form of imperial culture. Thank you. Within this really busy mosaic of different peoples and places. Alexander I in the early 19th century referred to the Baltic Germans as his most loyal servitors, and he paid them handsomely, as did all the other Russian czars, for their dedication to the crown. They'd been on the land in the Baltic since the Middle Ages, and they found their way of getting along with just about every empire that showed up. The Swedes, the Danes, the Poles, and certainly the Russians. And the Russians appreciated the services of the Baltic German knights, who then became Baltic German nobles. They ultimately ended up in some very, very comfortable spots within the Russian system. Baltic German generals commanded the Russian army, Baltic German admirals sailed the Russian fleet. Scientists and scholars ran or contributed certainly immensely to the Russian academic establishment. Baltic Germans had a remarkable place in late imperial Russia, Russian politics and culture. But they weren't apart. They too were blended in. For all of the ways in which they cut themselves off and took care of their own business on their German estates, many of the Baltic German aristocratic houses, Ungerns included, had Russian lines. They had connections to Russia. There were marriages with members of the Russian nobility. Baltic German fathers and mothers, aristocratic fathers and mothers, insisted that their children needed to learn Russian because Russian was the language of the state. And some of them went so far as to give their children Russian names. Ungern's name is one of these hybrids. Nikolai, Roman, Max. Max presumably is the short for Maximilian. That's not very Russian, but the other two certainly were. Like all the other imperial peoples in the empire, the barons cemented their relationship with the state and the diversity of the state through imperial institutions. This is certainly true of Ungern's life as well. Schools, the army. In Ungern's case, I'm going to skip ahead here. Whoops. A particular, I guess I describe it in this context as a subculture, a particular subordinate society within the army, the world of the Cossacks. The Cossacks historically were frontiersmen, organized frontier societies on the edges of the steppe, on the European side of Russia. Over time, they were absorbed into the Russian state, turned from rebellious frontiersmen into state servitors, and ultimately into a division of the military. They have a special function and structure within the army. Cossacks were expected to, in effect, finance themselves. They were cavalrymen. They were supposed to show up on the line, on the borders of the Russian state with their own mount, and to, in effect, take care of their own military tour. And then they were released to return to their farm and take care of their household economies. Ungern served with a particular Cossack host, the Transbaikal Cossacks in far eastern Siberia, here. Beyond Lake Baikal, Transbaikal. And these Cossacks were, in effect, a kind of alter ego to the Baltic German aristocrats that Ungern grew up with on the far other side of things. The Baltic German aristocrats were the ultimate European cosmopolitans who also found their way into high Russian culture. The Transbaikal Cossacks were the ultimate frontiersmen who adapted to the varieties of their particular location and ultimately represented just as a hybrid and mixed culture as the aristocrats in Reval. Who were the Transbaikal Cossacks? There were about 240,000 people in the very early 20th century. About 15% of them were made up, about 85% of them were Russian, or ethnic Russian, or Eastern Slavic. And the remainder were made up of peoples more indigenous to the region, Buryats and Tungus. All the groups connected with one another. They intermarried, they talked, they shared and developed common cultures. This combination of photos shows a little bit of how the Russian Cossacks were, in fact, in this particular part of the empire, a very mixed community. On the left is an image of a Transbaikal Cossack who is very obviously either a Buryat or a Tungus. And on the right side of the picture is a mixed Russian and Buryat Tungus family from the region. Ungern lived with these people right on the Russo-Chinese-Mongolian border as a young man. And it's hard not to believe that it was this experience right after military school that further drew him to Eastern questions, and probably in some way had something to do with the steps he would take later in his life with the Mongolian campaign. In this, do I have about 10 minutes? Is that about right? I was counting, sorry, about roughly when you started. So this very complicated mixed cultural world is also going through tremendous social and economic change in Ungern's period. This is an age of remarkable development in Russia. Fantastic economic growth, leaps in literacy, leaps in mobility, campaigns of Russification that are designed on the part of the government, played out in slightly different ways in different places, to try and craft the empire into a more governable society, a society that hews a little bit more to a common Russian culture, so that it can be, in effect, better administered, turned into being a body that would be more efficient. Some of the expressions of this Russification were extremely brutal and overbearing, and they're the ones that have ended up in our history books by and large. And Russification is associated with policies against Poles, against Ukrainians, against Jews, abusive anti-democratic politics designed to rein in troublesome nationalities. But understood more broadly, Russification was a program of modernization that included a variety of adaptations to different places, and obviously allowed a variety of people to make some kind of connection to Russia. This period also saw a dramatic tightening up of Russian space. This map of the Trans-Siberian, which is arguably the greatest industrial achievement of late Tsarism, is really one of those wonderful historical documents that seem to sum up all the enthusiasm and expectation of a historical time. This map, to me, makes the distance between Moscow on the left and the Sea of Japan on the right look like all you have to do is take a couple skips and you will be 5,000 miles away. And indeed, this is a trip that takes 9 days, still today. Trips before took months, if not longer. So there was a great revolution, a kind of Einsteinian shift that's unfolding for Russians at the time. This map seems to capture it. When we put the tremendous diversity of the empire that we just sort of thought about together with these great changes that are unfolding, regardless of the other tremendous political pressures, not to mention political blunders that are unfolding in terms of geopolitics, you can see how there's a potentially combustible mix, something that's going to at least have the potential to explode. In this diversity, there's a tremendous opportunity for unity, but there's also opportunity for disunity. And the very end of Ungern's life, the last 7 years or so, from 1914 to 1921, this passage through an era of crisis for the Russian Empire, this really is a voyage into disunity. Diversity producing disunity, but weirdly, strangely, still pulling a certain amount of unity with it. This poster speaks to some of the ferocity of the Great War in Russia, which ultimately so profoundly destabilized the Russian state that it led to epic political change, the overthrow of Russian Tsarism, the unleashing of a great deal of confusion that didn't settle for another 4 years. Ungern's life, as we know it in the history books, the life that seems to matter the most to historians who study him, is located in especially this time, this period of the Russian Revolution and the Civil War. And Ungern brings into the Revolution and Civil War his experience in the Great War, fighting all across the fronts, exposed to tremendous carnage and organized as well as casual violence. And then he performs one of the great, rituals of the unraveling of the war in Russian imperial space that contributes to everything else that develops. He begins to move in the way that he'd been moving before, in the way that all the technologies now allow people to move easily. And he takes, along with millions of other men, the habits of violence of this front, and it moves into the broader chaos and instability, volatility of the Civil War. A war where you had to pick which side you were on. This poster from the Civil War years, the red poster, is asking this Cossack in the middle, Kazakh, who are you with? With them or with us? And that was the basic question that people faced all across the Russian Empire, in particular in volatile borderlands that were in some respects up for grabs, including the Transbaikal, where Ungern was located. Ultimately, Ungern's campaign fails. As we know, he completely misestimated the forces that were against him by the end. Perhaps he unrealistically overemphasized the potential for restoring the empires that were lost. But what's interesting is that he ends up, on the last day of his life, face to face with people really not just like him, but close enough that we can talk about them with the same language. Ungern was an imperial person shaped by the diversities of his state and all the complexities of the tremendous transformations of his time. His accusers were just that diverse. Stalin wasn't at the trial. Trotsky didn't go. Lenin definitely sent a telegram instructing people in Novomir lives to take care of this man quickly and shoot him. But on stage, right across from him, was one of the great faces of the Soviet state in Stalin's time. This is before Stalin's time, so he wasn't famous yet, but he would become so. This is Emelian Yaroslavsky, standing here, erect behind that small table. He becomes one of the great propagandists of Stalinist state. He leads really remarkably extreme anti-clerical campaigns beginning in the late 1920s, and he's associated with some of the politics of the terror of the 1930s. He's ultimately venerated by the Soviet state, and I guess by implicit allowance venerated by the current Russian government because his remains are still located in the Kremlin Wall. Well, who is Emelian Yaroslavsky? He's Minei Bubelman. He's a Jew from Chita in eastern Siberia. He's traveled the empire more or less as an exile and a refugee. He's a polyglot. He participates in an incredibly cosmopolitan underground revolutionary culture that, because of the turmoil of the Russian Revolution, managed to find itself in charge. And he's now ultimately in a position to deliver the revolution's justice against, in effect, a kind of alter ego, a kind of cousin gone wrong from his point of view. This is really a trial in which the varieties of the diversity of the Russian Empire meet face to face. And it's a reminder of the very tangled road that I took to my project. And in closing, I just want to make a reference to this. When I first came to Ungern's story, what immediately arrested me was just the outrageousness of it all. Just how oversized and confusingly strange it was. And I found myself stepping into imagining, telling a story like the one, in effect, I was reading about. Because, of course, I found Ungern first in the histories of other historians. In fact, at the Wilson Center some years ago, I delivered a paper on the outrageous life of Ungern. I then traveled into his life and realized that there were certainly unique and even eccentric sides to this man, but that he was actually allowing us to see another story. And it was then that I realized that I couldn't participate in the illusion of this picture. This is a wonderful engraving that sort of opens up the whole question of biography. On the left is Samuel Johnson. On the right is James Boswell. Between them lies the greatest biography in the English language. I think people still say that. Is that true? Certainly much extolled. Boswell's Life of Johnson, published in 1791, that supposedly, for all of us, displays for the modern reader, the man and woman of modern sensibilities, exactly how you capture a life. To be fair to this painting, to this engraving, Boswell did indeed know Johnson and had many opportunities to talk to him, and certainly to see him face to face and walk around him. But as I thought about my prospect, the prospect of working with Baron Ungern as a biographer and telling his outrageous, eccentric individual life, I realized I really couldn't approximate this methodological moment. I couldn't really see the man. I couldn't expect to walk around him. I couldn't really expect to know what was in his head. All I could really get a grip on was the places that he went to and the small trail of evidence that he dragged behind him, the small records that accrued to him as he moved, as he was kept track of by key institutions like the army and the aristocracy. And so that's how I began my pursuits, thinking I would write a biography of Ungern, and instead ended up writing a biography of the empire. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you so much for this beautifully rendered presentation. Fascinating history. The floor is open for your comments and questions. If you could please wait for the microphone back there. And please state your name and affiliation if you like, so that our speaker knows. So, questions, comments?
I'm going to start us off. I could. Oh, didn't see that hand. We'll go to you next if I could. So would you say that Baron Ungern did you a favor by being as elusive as he was in not sharing his thoughts very readily, except until the last moments of his life, and that your inability to write a conventional biography allowed you to kind of reconceptualize this project as a kind of a biography of the Russian Empire?
Well, I think in a nutshell, yes. I mean, historians can't really do much more than their sources allow them. That is to say, we're not supposed to make things up entirely.
Evidence.
But I think we do bear a responsibility to be creative with the things that come to us. The last thing we would want to do is write a history that is a repetition of our sources, because that's not what history is. We're not record keepers. We're interpreters. So the documents and other kinds of sources that come to us, they speak to us of some representation of the past. And then we have to meet those materials with our own creative leaning in, I guess I'd say. The fact that Ungern didn't come out and say anything to me meant that I had to lean in more. And really think about what would happen if I didn't. Some of the books that I shared with you that were a part of my reading as I went into the project covered a lot of empty ground with conjectures about Ungern. Not really located clearly in time and place, but operating out of some presumption about what must have been in his head. And I realized that most of that positioning had everything to do with reading back from the very end of the story. This really dramatic play of months when he takes Ungern, imagines rebuilding empires, manages to get everything wrong so dramatically that his own men turn against him. He's bundled up, sent to the Reds, and tried and shot. I mean, it's really a remarkable tale, all transfolding in just a few months. So much of the emptiness in terms of documentary record of his earlier years was read by historians and writers too, not necessarily everyone a professional historian, seeking to explain that moment by reading that moment back into what was before. And I realized that on some level that made me uncomfortable, that it seemed like I would find a better solution to how things played out as they did by starting with who he was in the beginning, rather than reading back from the end to see who he must have been all along. And I think as you are faced with gaps in the record and the intriguing quality of some of the sources that come to you, you make these creative adaptations, and it's not out of some sort of what do you call it? It's not some sort of sharpened brilliance inside of me or anything. It was more my own stumbling along, you know, my own adaptation to the sources, and then my own bumping up against my professional sensibilities. Oh, well, I don't think I can say that. You know, I don't think I can say somebody said that he killed a cat when he was 6. Therefore, he would be a monster of the Russian Civil War.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Karl-Henrik Schwind. I'm an independent scholar. I'm just wondering about this category of empire, appreciating that you're a Russian historian. I'm wondering to what extent is it empire and to what extent is it Russian empire? Could we imagine this kind of a person emerging in the British Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire or even in the American Empire? We do have some renegades who went after Central America in the 1850s who might have been just as crazy.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. I think there are aspects of Ungern's story that we can follow in all kinds of histories. I think it's appropriate to describe him in some regards as an adventurer, as someone who takes full advantage of the spaces and privileges of his particular class in his particular spaces, and you see that unfolding in all kinds of other locations. There are ready analogies to Ungern in the works of other historians to figures we surely know better, true historical figures like T. Lawrence, that's Lawrence of Arabia, and fictionalized figures who seem to capture something real, like Colonel Kurtz in Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And I think that it's fair to place Ungern in these categories. I don't believe that Russia and its diversity, its particular complexities, separated entirely from other traditions, other experiences. That said, as a historian, I am excited by the particulars of things, and going into the particularities of the Russian Empire, you do find a special imperial morphology, something that's different from the terrain of other imperial states. So much of Russian imperial history accumulates over a very, very long time, and it becomes channeled through patterns of cohabitation, both political between elites and much more mundane cohabitations between ordinary people. And Ungern's life takes us into a variety of these particular regional imperial cultures. I just mentioned a couple of them in my remarks: his Baltic German aristocratic ancestry, the Transbaikal Cossacks on the other side of things. But there are many others that he encounters that he's not as shaped by, but that others certainly were. And I think that those particular subcultures are special to their place. They're created by special histories. It's not that you wouldn't see the same kinds of influences at work in other empires that I would know less well, but I do think that the place and the history of places creates unique configurations. And Russia's historical space in this kind of poorly defined Eurasian megacontinent is interestingly special in some respects. That's what I would say.
Dan Lieberman, you mentioned Prince Michael, and there's sort of a cult of Prince Michael. Who claim that he would saw for a day, that he was a very democratic individual who managed to get some democratic legislation passed, and they don't know what happened to him. He disappeared. I don't know if, I wonder if you could shed some light on that.
Oh no, I don't think there's any doubt as to what happened to him. He was shot. He was murdered by in the aftermath of the Bolshevik takeover. He did not. He wasn't arrested and set for trial, and it's not clear how far up the chain his murder was approved. But he was killed in the summer of 1918, I believe. So
Did he serve as Tsar for a day?
Oh yes, yeah. Well, yes. But I mean, the abdication in favor of Michael was set up by Tsar Nicholas to, in effect, provide for his own gentle exit while assuring the continuity of the dynasty. Michael judged the situation to be, in fact, too risky, too unlikely to produce a good outcome for the Romanov house at that moment. So the terms of his abdication were that he would respect the will of the people in a vote for the Constituent Assembly that would determine whether Russia would resume a monarchical course or not. So in effect, he simply stepped aside. If that's what you mean by democratic legislation, then yes, he was, in a very basic sense, saying, we're going to let, or I believe that the people should vote as to whether monarchical form is the right form for Russia. It might have been a democratic concession. It was certainly a very practical one, because it was clear that there was one of the remarkable achievements of Nicholas II was that he absolutely dismantled, not single-handedly, there were people helping him, but he managed to get a lot of things wrong too. He dismantled the legitimacy of the Tsarist regime. And his brother was in a very, very difficult spot, virtually unknown to the broader public, in the shadow of a failed Tsar, against the backdrop of a war that was grinding on and on. And I think it was actually a very astute political move to stand aside and to speak of the popular vote and to exit the scene. He certainly didn't ask to be arrested and ultimately shot. I'm not justifying his treatment in any regards, but I think, I guess I don't read his act so much as an act of democracy, but of reasonable political calculation in a kind of impossible moment.
Well, Nicholas is considered the last Tsar. Could Michael technically be considered the last Tsar? Or?
Yeah, technically he's supposedly, yes. A very brief period.
Okay. Definitely.
About the cloak.
Yes.
Very exciting. But can you say more about what it meant to Ungern and what it meant, whether there's documentation that he wore it with a special feeling on?
Yeah.
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry, Dan Rosenblum.
Thank you for the question, yeah. There's only one reference in the documents that speak to, in which Ungern seems to speak of the cloak. There are descriptions of him wearing it by others, but in the interrogations that followed his capture by the Reds, in a summary of a session with him, he's described as having said that he wore the cloak so that he would be more visible in battle. And he made no other reference. But obviously it was a political uniform that was establishing or attempting to establish his legitimacy with his Mongol allies. I have to say, I don't see it as outlandish a step as it would have been seen from other ends of the Russian Empire, because in the Transbaikal there was a ready mixing of Mongols and Mongols from what the Chinese call Outer Mongolia, broadly speaking, we say Halka Mongolia, and another Mongol people, the Boreas, Manchu people like the Manchu-speaking people like the Tungus. There was a lot of moving back and forth. Cossacks were known as frontier societies that borrowed and adapted the clothing of the peoples around them, most markedly, and now fully established as completely normalized within the Russian tradition, the dress of the Cossacks of the North Caucasus and the Don, wearing the Cherkaska, which is this long, I guess we would have to call it a robe, cut differently than the Mongolian deal, but clearly an adaptation of the dress of Caucasian mountaineers, and that Tsar Nicholas took portraits of himself wearing a Cherkaska. So Cossacks are, as a culture, even though there are many different Cossack cultures, broadly speaking, we can identify them with this sort of frontier cross-dressing, I guess I'd say. So in that respect, it doesn't strike me as terribly odd. But his adaptation of the uniform, it seems like a purposeful, a willful act to pull his commitment to the Russian Empire and his sense of comfort within the Russian Empire into the new age, the age that he was fighting for. And that's very interesting to me. Though I have to say, it wasn't interesting enough to me to actually put the thing on. And I know I'm on film now, so I probably shouldn't say this. But in that room, talking to this very nice lady, she said, well, you try it on. I said, oh gosh, well, no. Thanks. I'll just look at it.
Thank you. Yes, over the back.
Vadim Allen, Voice of America News, Russian Service. Thank you for the presentation. Could you elaborate a little more, if there is any information, what position did Baron Ungern envision for himself once the empire is reinstated and the war is over?
Yeah, right. Well, it's very interesting. You know, his persona is largely invisible for the great stretch of his life. There's some references to what he was like as a boy, how he performed as a student, but the only real expression that we ever get of who he was to himself emerges at the very end of his life in these letters that he's sending out to would-be allies, and then in these expansive transcripts rendered of his interrogations by the Reds. Both of these sources are, you know, usefully complicated because they're political documents. In one of them, Ungern is trying to persuade other people. In another, he's, I guess you might say, still trying to persuade people, but certainly, in each case, he's concerned with a kind of legacy, a kind of justification. The only sort of outline that I would say we get of how he imagined himself in the moment, and by extension, how he might play in a reconstituted imperial world, was as the ultimate loyal imperial servitor. He was, in his own mind, the truest of the aristocrats. The world works because it's ruled by kings. Lords, aristocrats, knights, they serve their kings. When the kings fall, the first duty is to restore them, is to bring them back. So when he appears in Mongolia, even though it very clearly serves his purposes as a kind of imported warlord to put the Mongolian theocratic ruler back in charge, it's also a reflection of this position that his role is to facilitate the return of order, and order is defined by monarchy. Any other order is an illusion, or worse. So I guess if I were to imagine what he might have seen looking forward, perhaps he saw himself as the ultimate kingmaker. Give him a lance, and a map, and he will ride, and a fiery steed, and he will ride to restore kings the world over. It's interesting. Some of the descriptions by his Bolshevik opponents really characterized him and made fun of him for this, casting him as a kind of medieval person. Another very, later to be prominent Bolshevik, writing about Ungern at the time, said how bizarre it was to hear this man speak of Genghis Khan in the age of Lenin. So a medieval man talking against the backdrop of world-shattering socialist revolution. But since one of my theories is that what we're really exploring here is a family quarrel in which everybody's different but also usefully similar, I have to trust the judgment of the people at the table. And my sense is that there was a little bit of that in Ungern. And there was a little bit of that in the old imperial aristocracy. There's a little bit of that in Tsar Nicholas's court. This sort of almost like a romanticized medieval notion of kingliness and a special spiritual bond between the court and the people and how the world should truly be ordered. And he does seem, you know, with just these faintest traces, but he does seem to have lived that. Yeah.
Could I ask, could you talk a little bit more about how he's received, if at all, in Russia today?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Ungern does have a following, naturally on the internet, where everybody seems to be. Members of the Russian right celebrate Ungern as a man who got things done. His anti-Semitism appeals to some people. He's also been seized upon as a useful figure by more influential figures, people who are a little less easy to categorize, like Alexander Putin, a neo-Eurasianist thinker, philosopher, who is to varying degrees, described as a man whose thought has influenced Putin and the broader circle around him. Dugin sees Russia as a special space with its own unique history built out of some of the cultural combinations that I was talking about, but informed with a greater mystical purpose. It's really ultimately a position that's profoundly anti-Western. Frankly, you can find some of that in Ungern too, as ironic as it is, because of course he himself is a product of a Western aristocracy. But he, in the letters that remained, completely excoriates the West. It's a putrid, corrupt civilization, gasping its last breath. Socialism is actually the crudest, most disastrous product of this corrupt society. So some of these utterances surely matter as well to people like Dugin. And there is there's a local interest in Ungern in places like the Transbaikal, because he's a kind of bogeyman of the Civil War in these parts. And I can just give you one interesting vignette that reminded me of how close Ungern is to the surface of things. I was waiting for a train in Manjuli, which is the Chinese border town in northwestern Manchuria. And I went to a beer bar near the station, and there was a fellow in there, another person who was not Chinese, say that. And I just assumed he was Russian. He must have assumed I was Russian. He asked me if I wanted a beer. I said, yeah. And then he said, so what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm a historian. I said, what? And then it's like, well, what do you study? And I said, well, I'm studying about the Civil War and Baron Ungern. And he paused for a second, and he put down his beard, and just looked at me and said, he was a bastard. I presume you didn't know him personally, this was just a few years ago, but he was channeling some deeper stories that were clearly at work on the land in those parts, and clearly reinforced by generations of Soviet popular culture, in which Ungern was cast as one of the bogeymen of the revolution.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much for this very fascinating story. My name is Diana Dumitro. I'm a Fulbright visiting scholar at Georgetown University. I'm a historian. I want to know maybe a little bit about anti-Semitism in Ungern's case. What are the sources of his anti-Semitism? I'm talking about like political, religious, like social.
Yeah, for him, it was a political position. First and foremost, Jews were socialists. Socialists are Jews. Socialists will destroy the world. Socialists must be destroyed. Jews too. That's it. In his interrogations, he spelled it out very clearly that way when the issue was raised by his interrogators. He did make some curious reference in at least one of the sessions to the fact that this of course is another anti-Semitic trope, that the Jews are actually, they're going to survive all of this, they've got it all figured out. They're ultimately actually, in some way, for all of their evil people to be emulated, admired, followed, I mean, in this, this is all alive in the history of the complexity of anti-Semitic prejudice, obviously. So, but that's about it. We don't see a lot more of it in his own words. Some of the memoirs that were produced by either people in Ungern at the time of this great pogrom, or later, who heard accounts from refugees, people leaving the city. They describe him as being implacable in his hatred of Jews.
But some of this is also, I mean, I don't know how finely we have to comb through this. I mean, there isn't necessarily that much of a mystery to find. But I think some of the descriptions of his anti-Semitism seem to be, rendered in a language that's making him into this impossible wild man that seems to fit with this broader image of a man unhinged, a deranged figure. And in that sense, I think there is a little bit of what you would have to call piling on, or at least adding to the stereotype. The core of the anti-Semitism is just straight up pure political anti-Semitism. Jews are Bolsheviks. Look at them, they're all Jews. Therefore, see a Jew, see a Bolshevik, get rid of the Bolshevik, that means you're getting rid of the Jew, that was it. And I say, the other elaborations, this bloodthirsty search to kill every Jew and other things that were supposedly attributed to him, I don't know how true that is. I don't know if we'll ever be able to prove it. It's not necessarily required. He was clearly anti-Semitic, and the anti-Semitism he expressed was of this very tight political sort.
On that note, I unfortunately have to draw this to a close, but before I do, just a few things. Remember, the book is outside, should you want to pick it up and read the story further, which I would encourage you to do. We have a reception that we hope you stay for, and you don't have to wait long before coming back and enjoying the intellectual fruits of the seminar, because on Monday, a long weekend away, Leila Fawaz will be here to talk about A Land of Aching Hearts, the Middle East